Imagine handing over your daughter's name at a convent door and having the nun who answers write down a different one instead, not her middle name, not a nickname, a completely new name chosen for her on the spot because the old one, the one her mother had called her every morning for 16 years, was, in the eyes of the woman holding the ledger, no longer needed. She would answer to Assumpta now, or Bernadette, or whatever saint's name was next on the list that month. That's not folklore, that's paperwork. Real ledgers, real ink, real names crossed out and replaced, in institutions that were still open, still doing a full day's laundry business, within living memory of people who are watching this video right now. Hi, friends. Tonight we're going somewhere quiet and a little heavy. The Magdalene Laundries and the tens of thousands of women who spent years, sometimes their whole lives, washing other people's linen behind convent walls, without ever once standing trial for anything. If you're settling in for the night, this is a good moment to do it properly. Dim the lamp down to just a glow. Pull the blanket up over your shoulders. This isn't a story that needs your full attention. Just enough of it to drift along beside it, the way you'd listen to rain against a window. So let's start gently with the ordinary sound of the place, because that's really what it was built on. Not screaming, not chains, just the ordinary sound of women working. You wake before the sun does. Not because anyone tells you the exact time. You've simply learned it, the way your body learns anything after enough repetition. A bell rings somewhere below, small and flat, more like a kitchen bell than a church one, and by the third ring you're expected to be dressed. The dormitory is long and narrow, iron beds in 2 facing rows, a washstand at the end, for however many women share that particular room. Sometimes 10, sometimes 30, depending on which laundry, which decade, which country you happen to be sent to. Ireland had the most of these, over 10 institutions running well into the 20th century, but they existed in Britain too, and in a handful of other countries, always under the same idea, that certain women needed to be kept somewhere out of sight, and kept busy while they were there. Your uniform is plain. Dark, high-collared, a little coarse against the skin, in a way you stop noticing after the first few weeks. Your hair, if it hasn't already been cut short on arrival, which it often was, less for punishment than for practicality around steam and machinery, is pinned back, plain, uniform, indistinguishable from the woman next to you. And that's rather the point. Indistinguishable. Because whatever brought you here, and the reasons genuinely varied more than people assume, the institution didn't especially want to know the details of your particular story. An unmarried mother sent by a family too embarrassed to keep her, a girl considered too flirtatious by a parish priest who'd never once spoken with her directly, a woman escaping a violent husband with nowhere else that would take her in, an orphan simply transferred over from another institution once she turned a certain age, with no family at all to ask questions. By the 20th century, the reasons for referral had become so broad that almost any woman a family or a court found inconvenient could be quietly signed over. None of them had been convicted of a crime. There was no judge, no jury, no sentence with an end date attached. You went in, and you stayed until someone with the authority to release you decided you could leave, which, for a great many women, simply never happened. The laundry itself starts early and runs long. If you've never stood over an industrial washtub for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours at a stretch, it's hard to describe how the smell settles into you. Hot cotton, lye soap, the mineral tang of hard water being boiled again and again, sheets from hotels, uniforms from hospitals, altar cloths from parish churches that had no idea, or perhaps every idea, whose hands had scrubbed them clean. The convent took in commercial contracts precisely because the labor cost nothing, no wages, ever, for any of it, and a laundry that pays no one for its work can undercut almost any competitor in town. You mangle sheets until your forearms ache in a specific, practiced way. You iron altar linens with a heavy flat iron heated on a stove in the corner, testing the heat against a wet finger, the way you were taught your first week and never told twice. Steam fogs the high windows so thoroughly that you often can't tell from inside, whether it's raining outside or merely gray. Someone nearby hums, very quietly, half under her breath. Not really a song, more a habit. The kind of small sound a person makes, just to prove to herself she still can. Meals are taken in silence, or close to it. Bread, sometimes dripping, tea strong enough to taste like tannin more than anything resembling flavor. A bell for the start of the meal, a bell for the end. If letters arrive from outside, and for many women they arrived rarely, if at all, they're read by someone else first. Censored isn't quite the right word, though it isn't wrong either. It was simply understood that what a mother might write, or what a woman might want to write back, was the convent's business as much as hers. And yet, and this is the part that surprises people most, daily life inside wasn't a horror story every hour of every day. It was, for long stretches, almost unbearably ordinary. Chapel bells at set times. A vegetable garden some of the women tended, weather allowing, hands in soil instead of soap for one small stretch of the afternoon. A cat that lived somewhere in the outbuildings and belonged unofficially to whichever woman fed it most consistently that week. Small, human, ordinary things, existing in the same rooms as something that was, underneath all that ordinariness, a form of unpaid, indefinite confinement. That contrast, the gentleness of the daily texture sitting right alongside the depth of what was actually happening, is, in its own quiet way, the hardest thing to hold on to about this story. It would be simpler if it had been cruel in an obvious way every single hour. It mostly wasn't. It was cruel in its permanence, in the not knowing when or if it would end. Some women were reclaimed, a family member arriving, eventually, to sign the necessary paper. Some were transferred to other institutions as they aged, still part of the same system, just a different building. And some simply stayed, grew old there, died there, decades after they'd first walked through that convent door as young women, and were buried, in many cases, in a plot on the convent grounds itself, under a headstone that sometimes carried the name the nuns had given them, rather than the one their mother had once called them by. Still working. Still washing. Still, in the eyes of the institution, unfinished. But here's the thing almost no one expects about how these places actually kept running for as long as they did. It wasn't fear that held the system together, day after day, year after year. It was something far quieter than that, something built into the letters, the visits, the paperwork itself, that made leaving feel almost impossible, even for a woman who wanted nothing more than to walk straight out that gate. And that's exactly where we're headed next. Here's the detail that unsettles people most, once they learn it. For long stretches of the day, in a great many of these laundries, the front gate wasn't actually locked, no bars. No guard standing watch with a set of keys. A woman could, in theory, simply walk down the drive, through the gate and into the street outside. And yet women who'd been there for years. Women who thought about that gate constantly, who dreamed about it, still didn't walk through it. Not because they couldn't. Because almost everything in their life outside had quietly been arranged, over months and years, to make walking through it pointless. Let's sit with that for a moment. Gently, before we go any further into tonight's story. The first thing taken from most women wasn't their freedom in any dramatic sense. It was their paperwork. Birth certificates, in an era before easy replacements, often stayed with the family or the institution that had placed her there in the first place. Without that single piece of paper, a woman in the mid-20th century couldn't easily get a job outside, couldn't rent a room of her own, couldn't prove to anyone who might ask exactly who she was. The convent, meanwhile, could vouch for her, but only as a resident, only as someone still under its roof. Then there was the matter of money, or rather, the complete absence of it. Decades of laundry work, 6 days a week, and not a single wage paid for any of it. The labor was considered, officially, a fair exchange for room, board, and moral guidance, which meant that even a woman who did walk out that unlocked gate walked out with nothing in her pocket. No savings, no means of getting further than the next town over before hunger made the decision for her. And then, quieter than either of those, there was shame. Not shame imposed only from outside, but shame that had, over enough years, settled into a woman's own sense of herself. If your own mother had signed the paper that sent you here, if your own parish priest had nodded along with the arrangement, it becomes very hard to imagine a version of the outside world that would take you back in warmly. Many women didn't stay because the gate was locked. They stayed because they'd come to believe, quite genuinely, that nowhere else would have them. Letters worked the same slow, quiet way. If a woman wrote home, and she was permitted to, within limits, that letter passed through convent hands before it left the building, and any reply passed through convent hands again on its way back in. Not always altered, often simply delayed, softened, or gently steered by whoever was reading it first. A daughter's plea to come home might arrive at her mother's door a full season after it was written, worn thin by that much waiting, and a mother's uncertain, guilt-ridden non-answer might take just as long coming back the other way. Two people who genuinely wanted to reach each other, separated by nothing more dramatic than a very slow, very careful postal system with a nun somewhere in the middle of it. It's a strange kind of imprisonment, when you think about it slowly enough. One built less out of iron and more out of paperwork, patience, and the ordinary human habit of assuming things will sort themselves out eventually. The nuns running these laundries weren't, for the most part, twirling any particular villainy in their heads. Many genuinely believed, within the framework of their time, that they were offering shelter and structure to women's society had already discarded. That belief didn't make the outcome any less confining. It just meant the confinement wore the softer clothing of good intentions, which is often the hardest kind to walk away from. There were, of course, women who did leave, plenty of them over the decades. A family member arriving, finally, with the necessary signature. A woman aging into her 30s or 40s and being quietly released once she was considered past whatever risk had brought her in as a girl. Occasionally, rarely, a woman simply walking, on a grey Tuesday morning, straight through that unlocked gate and never coming back, choosing hunger and uncertainty over one more year of steam and silence. Those stories exist too, and they matter just as much as the ones that ended differently. But for a significant number of women, the exit came only one way. Through the convent's own burial ground, on the far side of the vegetable garden, under a small stone with a first name on it and very little else, meals continued all the while in that same practiced silence. The bell for the start, the bell for the end, sheets from the same 3 hotels, altar cloths from the same handful of parishes, arriving every week regardless of how many women were currently well enough to iron them, or how many had quietly taken ill in the damp of the washroom that particular winter. The business of clean linen didn't pause for anyone's grief, and in its own strange way, that steadiness was its own kind of mercy, a routine so fixed that a woman never had to decide, each morning, what came next. It had already been decided, years ago, by someone else entirely. There's a detail from the record-keeping of several of these institutions that tends to stay with people longer than almost anything else: the entry logs. Alongside each woman's convent name, her assigned bed, her work rotation, there was often a single line for what the ledger called her reason for admission. Reading through surviving copies of these logs today, historians have found that single line filled in, again and again, with words that reveal far more about the society doing the judging than about the woman being judged. Wayward, immoral tendencies, father deceased, mother unable to manage, sometimes simply orphan, no place else, a whole life reduced to 4 or 5 words in someone else's handwriting, and for a considerable number of those women, more than the public record acknowledged for a very long time, there was one more line in that ledger that mattered more than any other. Not reason for admission, something that came a little later, usually a year or so after arrival, in a different hand, added almost as an afterthought, a birth date, and beside it, a child's name that would very rarely appear in that woman's life again. That's where we're headed next. Not to the mothers who scrubbed the sheets, but to the small, quiet rooms down the corridor from them, where a completely separate arrangement was already being made, for babies who had done nothing at all except arrive at the wrong time, to the wrong family, in the wrong decade. The room down the corridor wasn't part of the laundry at all. It didn't smell of lye or steam. It smelled faintly of milk and boiled linen, and the particular staleness of a room that got very little fresh air. And for many women, it was a room they were allowed into only a handful of times, at fixed hours, under supervision, to feed a baby that had technically been born to them, and that they were, technically, still the mother of. Technically mattered a great deal in these institutions. It was often the only thing standing between a woman and her own child. Many of the women sent to these laundries hadn't arrived because of laundry at all. They'd arrived pregnant or newly delivered from a separate but closely linked kind of institution, the mother and baby home. Some laundries had one attached directly to the same grounds. A young woman would give birth there, often with no anesthetic offered for what was considered, in the thinking of the time, a fitting discomfort for the circumstances that had brought her to that bed. She'd be given a short window afterward, weeks, sometimes a small number of months, to nurse the child. And then, in the great majority of cases, the child would be taken from her permanently, placed for adoption, often to a family who paid a fee for the privilege, with no requirement that the birth mother ever be told where. She, meanwhile, would frequently be transferred straight into the laundry itself, to begin working off what the institution described, plainly, in its own paperwork, as the cost of her stay. Grief had no line item in that ledger. The work simply continued the next morning. Same bell, same tub, same 6-day week, whether or not a woman had said goodbye to her own child 3 days earlier or 3 hours earlier. It's worth pausing here, gently, to say plainly what's true and what isn't, because this is a part of the story where exaggeration does no one any favors, and the plain facts are difficult enough on their own. Not every mother and baby home was attached to a laundry. Not every laundry housed mothers separated from infants. The systems overlapped in some places and ran entirely separately in others, across different decades and different countries, and record-keeping was often poor enough that historians still can't give a precise account of exactly how many women passed through which combination of institution. What the surviving records do show, consistently, across dozens of these homes, is a pattern. Infants and mothers kept apart as a matter of policy, adoptions arranged with minimal consent and even less follow-up, and in a number of documented cases, infant mortality rates within these homes running well above what was typical for the wider population at the time. A fact that took decades and considerable pressure from survivors and journalists before it was properly investigated. You don't need the darkest version of this story for it to be a genuinely heavy one. The plain version is heavy enough on its own. Let's slow down and sit inside one small, ordinary moment of it, the way we've been doing all night. Not to dwell on suffering, but because the small moments are where the real texture of a life like this actually lived. Picture the visiting hour. A narrow room, a row of hard chairs, a nun standing near the door, with a small clock she checks more than once. A young woman is brought in, told she has 20 minutes, and a baby is placed in her arms by another woman, sometimes a nun, sometimes an older resident whose job it had become, over years, to be the one who carried infants back and forth between the nursery and their mothers. 20 minutes, long enough to memorize the exact weight of a small body against your arm. Not long enough for anything else at all. Some women, the record shows, sang very quietly during those minutes, the same simple lines over and over, less a song and more a kind of holding on, something to do with a voice that couldn't do anything else useful in that room. Some said almost nothing, just watched, the way you'd watch a candle burning down, knowing exactly how much wax was left. When the clock reached its 20 minutes, the baby was lifted gently away, and the woman was led back toward the washroom, where a mangle full of hotel sheets was, by then, already waiting for her attention, because the linen order for that week didn't know or care what had just happened in the room down the corridor. There is, in among all this heaviness, one detail that surprises almost everyone who hears it, and it deserves its place here precisely because it isn't grim. Because even inside a system built on separation, women found small, quiet ways to hold on to each other anyway. In several surviving accounts, older residents, women who'd been in the laundry for years, sometimes decades, and who had long since lost their own children to adoption, took on an almost grandmotherly role toward the newer mothers and their infants, without ever being asked to. They'd slip an extra half-hour of comfort into a visiting session when the supervising nun's attention drifted. They'd remember and quietly pass along small details about a baby's first days that a grieving mother had been too overwhelmed to notice herself, which side he preferred to be held on, the particular way she'd startle at a door closing. Kindness, rationed carefully, passed hand to hand between women who had nothing else of their own left to give. That kindness didn't undo any of what the system had taken. But it meant that inside the coldest part of the institution, something warm kept finding a way to survive anyway, in defiance of every rule designed to stamp it out. That's worth remembering, on a night like tonight, just as much as the harder facts are. The paperwork side of all this, the adoption files, the birth records, the correspondence between convents and adoptive families, has its own long, quiet history, one that stretched on for decades after these institutions themselves finally began closing. Many adopted children, grown into adults, spent years of their own lives simply trying to locate a single accurate document confirming who their birth mother had been. Files were incomplete. Names had sometimes been altered at multiple points along the way, first by the institution, occasionally again by the adopting family. Requests for information filed by grown children decades later were met, more often than anyone would like, with the plain, maddening answer that the relevant records simply could not be located. It would be many more years, well past the closing of the last of these laundries, before governments in several countries began commissioning the kind of formal inquiries that finally pieced together, from surviving fragments, something closer to the true scale of what had happened across all these interconnected institutions. Official apologies came later still. For a great many of the women and children involved, those apologies arrived only after they themselves had already died, waiting for one. We'll come to that reckoning a little further along tonight. The moment, decades later, when the doors finally, truly closed for good, and the world outside was forced to reckon with exactly how long for good had actually taken. But before we get there, there's one more piece of daily life inside these laundries worth sitting with gently, the strange, almost accidental economy of small comforts that grew up around the edges of all this hardship, the little things women traded, hoarded, and protected fiercely, because they were among the only things in that building that were truly, completely their own, a shared hairpin, a pressed flower kept folded inside a saltwater, a particular corner of the washroom windowsill claimed silently, year after year, by whichever woman got there first each morning. Small things, but in a place built to strip almost everything away, small things were where a person's whole remaining self quietly went to live. The last one didn't close in some distant century. It closed in 1996, Gloucester Street, in Dublin, within the living memory of people who now have grown children of their own, some of whom are, quite possibly, watching this video tonight. Sit with that for a moment, the way we've been sitting with everything else tonight, slowly, without rushing past it. A woman could have entered that laundry as a girl in the 1950s and still have been standing at that same mangle, ironing the same hotel sheets, the year the Spice Girls released their first single. Two entirely different worlds, somehow occupying the same decade, one of them completely unaware the other still existed. By the time these laundries began closing, quietly, one by one, over the final decades of the 20th century, the reasons weren't dramatic either. It wasn't a single scandal, a single door kicked open. It was simpler and slower than that. Fewer families were sending daughters away in the first place, as attitudes shifted. The commercial laundry contracts that had kept these places financially viable began drying up, as hotels and hospitals switched to modern, cheaper industrial services. and the religious orders running them, often aging themselves, with fewer new sisters joining each year, simply found it harder and harder to keep the whole operation running. The system didn't so much collapse as quietly run out of the conditions that had let it exist for so long. What came after was slower still, and in its own way, just as heavy as anything we've talked about tonight. For years after the last laundry closed its doors, the story remained mostly private, passed between survivors, between families, rarely spoken of in public. It took investigative journalism, and eventually the discovery of unmarked graves on former convent grounds, to push the full scale of it into daylight. Government inquiries followed, slowly, taking testimony from thousands of women who were by then in their 60s, 70s, 80s. Official reports were published, and in 2013 the Irish government issued a formal state apology, an acknowledgement, finally on paper, of what tens of thousands of women had lived through without ever having broken a single law. For some of those women, that apology arrived in time to hear it read aloud themselves. For others, it arrived only in time for a daughter or a granddaughter to read it on their behalf at a grave with a first name and very little else carved into the stone. There is, thankfully, a gentler part of this story too, and it belongs here at the end because it's true and because a night like this should close on something a little softer than paperwork and apologies. In the years since, many survivors have told their own stories, in their own words, in their own time, on their own terms, finally. Some have reconnected with children lost to adoption decades earlier. Against every discouraging record and every could not be located, they were once told. Some found each other again as elderly women, sitting across a table from a grown child, filling in, slowly, the 20 minutes that had once been all they were given, stretched out now across an entire afternoon, an entire evening. However much time either of them had left to give, that's a kind of ending this story deserves to have, even if it came far too late for far too many. If you think back now, gently, to how we began tonight, that quiet detail about a name written into a ledger, a girl's own name crossed out and replaced with one chosen for her by someone else, it's worth sitting, one last time, with what that really meant. A name is such a small thing, and yet giving it back, decades later, to a woman who'd spent half her life answering to somebody else's choice instead, turned out to matter more than almost anything else anyone could offer her. Somewhere tonight, in a small quiet room, not so different from the ones we've described, an elderly woman is sleeping under her own name again, still tired, in the ordinary way anyone is tired at the end of a long life. Still home, wherever home finally became for her. Still, at last, entirely her own. If this story kept you company tonight, you're welcome to like or subscribe, but only if it felt worth it. Either way, thank you for spending this quiet hour here. And now, gently, let the room go still. Let your own blanket settle around you the way it's meant to. Whatever your day held, it's over now, and there's nothing left to carry into tomorrow but rest. Sleep well, friends, sleep well.